Eden Memorial Chapels understands Jewish funerals can take many forms. Some are very orthodox, while others are more conservative or of a reformed nature. There's no one better in New York or New Jersey. Go to EdenMemorial.com.
The sound of praise for your Sunday morning.
The only one who could ever teach me.
Introducing Reverend A.R. Bernard of the Christian Cultural Center.
Was the son of a preacher man.
And Rabbi Joseph Potasnik of Religion on the Line.
The only one who could ever teach me.
Now, on Talk Radio 77 WABC, here's the Rev and the Rabbi, where faith matters.
Good morning, I'm Rabbi Joseph Potasnik.
And I'm Reverend A.R. Bernard. Rabbi, your voice is getting better.
Thank you. Well, we both are suffering. There's some kind of plague. You know, I got to look at the Bible to see this hoarseness.
I hope not.
Well, we were victorious at the end. We had to go through some suffering, but eventually we were victorious. And you see, Curtis Sliwa, he's here at all hours. And you see now that Columbus was determined to be a Jew.
Wait. Run that by me again. Say that again. Columbus was determined.
Yeah, many
to be a
people
Jew.
who looked into the ancestry of Columbus found that he was a Sephardic Jew. So that means that he was a member of our people. And if that's the case, then I'm related to Curtis Sliwa. I don't know what that does for me in terms of my relationships
I was
out
just
there.
about to ask you.
I may not be able to broadcast that publicly, but just between you and me, it's something. All right.
Maybe you get a red.
I have one. I have a red jacket and beret because Curtis was at my son's bar mitzvah years ago, and he made a whole presentation, and it was really one of those special moments. And my son never forgave me. But,
I'm glad you defined special moment.
Anyway, so this is the holiday of Sukkot. Oh, before I forget that, we got to mention, we're going to be at the Sheen Center Tuesday night.
Oh, that's right.
With Cardinal Dolan.
The Rev, the Rabbi, and the Cardinal. The Rev, the Rabbi, and the Cardinal. Sounds like a setup for a joke.
And we are, we invite people to come.
Yeah, it's open to the public, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, all right, the Sheen Center. In Manhattan. Come, be part of the audience, be part of the discussion. And I think you'll see how faith leaders who differ from one another in certain areas are able to sit together and have discourse. Difference in discourse, something unheard of today in so many circles. You can't even mention who you're going to vote for, because you're afraid you're going to lose a friend if you talk about who you're voting for, and that's ridiculous. We should not be at that stage, that extreme stage. So hopefully,
and so it's going to be at the Sheen Center for Thought and Culture, Bleecker Street, downtown Manhattan, right?
Yep.
And it starts at 7 p.m.
Yes, 7 p.m. And look forward to being with the
6:30?
Cardinal. Right, as always, doors open 6:30. Mary Lou Pagano, who's the executive director, does a great job, and so many good people there. We look forward to joining them. So please,
please come out and join us as we have a great conversation.
So the sukkah, sukkah is the universal symbol of peace. We say when the Messiah comes or comes again, that the Messiah will teach us how to live and dwell in a sukkah, a fragile hut, a very, very temporary dwelling without bars, without alarms, because it says that if you really want to live together, you shouldn't have to have walls to separate. You should be able to have a relationship that's secure, that's strong, and that is what Sukkot is all about, sitting together with one another in that very interesting situation. It's a holiday of happiness. That's what happiness is. It's being with one another.
That's interesting, Rabbi. In our New Testament, we have the Apostle Paul's writings, and in one of his letters to one of the churches in Asia, he says that we live this life in earthen vessels. And he took that, of course, from the whole idea of a tent, a fragile housing that we have a most deep and complex living experience here on earth. And we have to do what we do from the power within us, but within this fragile reality in which we live. That's a wonderful, wonderful metaphor for the
Yeah.
realities of life.
And how do
Yeah.
we keep a sukkah standing when you have the winds of hatred, the winds, of racism, anti-Semitism, all the other forms of hatred that challenge your existence? How do you dwell in that sukkah? And there's a interesting discussion amongst Jewish legalists. What happens if one wall is missing, one wall is taken? And we say that, well, it's still a sukkah if you can keep it standing, even with 2.5 walls, let alone three, but let alone 2.5. If you can keep it standing, you're still living in a sukkah. So it's the ideal and the real. The ideal, you have 4 walls, but in the real, things don't always work that way.
The fragility of life.
Yeah.
I like that. I love that.
Yeah.
Excellent.
So we have a guest coming on today, Jonathan Wachtel, who is superb. And we haven't even talked to him yet. But he's superb because he's a reminder. He's a living reminder of what discussion can be all about. He worked with Nikki Haley. He's been a global affairs analyst on a host of TV stations. But Jonathan comes in a very, very, what's the word? Civil, respectful. Let me use respectful because the word respect has gone out of the dictionary for so many people. But he's able to respect different points of view and yet present his view.
Yeah. So we're looking forward to it. Stay tuned for more of the Rev and the Rabbi right here Sunday morning on WABC.
Reverend A.R. Bernard, Rabbi Joseph Potasnik, the Rev and the Rabbi. Talk Radio 77 WABC and the all-new WABCRadio.com.
Welcome back. I'm Rabbi Joseph Potasnik.
And I'm Reverend A.R. Bernard.
Reverend, we are honored once again to have as a guest Jonathan Wachtel, Global Affairs Analyst, former Director of Communications for Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley. Jonathan, thanks so much for being with us.
Pleasure, gentlemen.
So, thank you.
I would say the world owes Israel a thank you. Right, Jonathan?
Look, Sinwar was one terrible dude. I've heard him called mini Hitler. Whatever you call him, he was a disruptor to the max, and he was out to make sure that the world would be in tumult as long as he could make it happen, as long as he was alive. And, this is not a fan of certain Western ideology, that's for sure. He was an Islamist. He believed in what he stood for and was willing to contaminate as many minds and souls as he could on this journey of, frankly, evil.
Jonathan, is there... Go ahead, Rabbi. Go ahead.
No, do you really think he cared about the Palestinians?
I do. I do. I mean, look... Of course, he cared about the Palestinians, but those Palestinians who towed the line and believed in his ideology and vision. And, it's one thing to be a practitioner of the 3 Abrahamic religions, but it's another to say that one religion should dominate over all the others. And his strain, which is just utterly Islamist, is what should be happening not just in Gaza, but, Hamas is its origins are the Muslim Brotherhood.
Right.
That's all about hard line, really unforgiving, intolerable Islam.
Yeah. What I was going to ask you, is there another example in history of Israel's, compared to Israel's actions? There are those who will point to Israel as being the aggressor. The other side says Israel is defending itself, but it seems determined to get at the root of this thing, almost cut off the head of the serpent. Do we have other examples of a nation going this far?
It's a very good question. It's hard to do a comparison like that. I mean, you have issues like the way that Russia's dealt with movements down in the Caucasus region, like the Chechnyas, in which you had an element of political Islam and territorial integrity of the Russian Federation and other complicated things like that. Sometimes you do have these crossovers. But to have a situation in which you have a tiny nation, Israel's absolutely tiny, and it's smaller than the size of the state of New Jersey, and then to be taking incoming, literally, from 7 different sources fed by the machinery of Iran and other benefactors. I mean, it really is a standalone, crazy dynamic.
Jonathan, go ahead, Rev.
No, I was just going to ask if that's why Israel is more open to this kind of criticism about its actions, because it seems maybe setting precedent.
Well, there's that, but also it's a numbers game. I mean, Israel, size is tiny and its population is tiny. So it's one thing when you're, in a sea in which your numbers are large and you get the ear of the rest of the world. But certainly the Jewish population, let alone Israel, is just a tiny fraction of 1% in the world in a sea of, 50 plus, close to 60 Organization of Islamic Conference countries, 20, almost 24 Arab countries. It's just by nature of what it is, a minority. And when you're a minority of minorities, your voice is hard to be heard in that massive sea.
So let me understand.
Let me just follow. The reason why I raise it is because, I stand with the state of Israel, stand with the Jewish people, may not agree, with the tactics that some of the state may employ, but I agree 100% that they have a right to defend themselves. But there are those who, are critical of that right and critical of those actions. So that's why I was curious to know how you responded to that question. Rabbi?
Yeah, Jonathan, when we hear that phrase, a right to defend itself, what does that really translate into? That you have the right when attacked to defend yourself, which I think belongs to any country, but there's an implication there that you don't seem to have the right to go in aggressively and remove the evil. You can defend, but you can't attack. Am I wrong in that analysis?
Yeah, that analysis is right. And it gets very complicated when it comes to the rest of the world, because you also have, from the inception of the, reestablishment of Israel as a homeland for the Jews, and other nationalities. I mean, let's not forget that 20% of Israel's population happens to be Arab Israeli. Mm-hmm. But you have a situation in which you have the United Nations in there. And not just the United Nations weighing in from New York, actually physically on the ground all over the Middle East, and completely involved in the Gaza situation, completely involved in Lebanon, where we're seeing activity, involved in the Golan Heights, involved in Syria, active there on the ground, their own interests in terms of, lack of a better way of putting it, a cottage industry with their own needs of personnel needs and justification of missions. And often those have come into direct conflict with the policies of Israel. So in defending itself, the country also has to fend off criticism from an organization that is, by nature of its construct and by nature of what its missions are, literally on the ground, that you have these areas in which you have conflict, and sometimes emotions and justified perspectives get bent out of shape. It all gets very warped and very not objective, very subjective in the way things play out. So this whole thing of defending oneself as a nation, Israel is held to an account that is just doubly, in fact, maybe even 10 times, maybe even more critical of the state. And that's reflected in the number of resolutions within the Security Council, within the General Assembly, within the Human Rights Council, in which you have this disproportionality that makes Israel seem like it's the size of, 7/8 of the world in terms of what's happening, when in fact it's just a tiny little corner of the world, but manages to eat up all the oxygen in the room because of the nature of that relationship and international perspectives on that relationship due to the UN.
Yeah, and the relationship with the United States. I mean, there is a bond between the two nations, and I don't know if Israel is being judged independently of its relationship with the United States. What are your thoughts?
I think there needs to be, of course, a clear distinction where U.S. foreign policy and Israel foreign policy lie. They're two separate countries, and one can't be calling the shots of the other, period. We have a lot of areas in which there's a lot of perspectives that are common, and there are going to be frictions. That is a natural thing, just as much as we have differences between the United Kingdom and the United States that create complications in perspectives. That's natural, and there shouldn't be this expectation that the United States will be lock in step with everything that the Netanyahu government does. Absolutely not. But what is a problem is when you have this attempt by some to have some sort of moral equivalency of the Israeli government's actions versus what Tehran's doing, for example, or what's coming out of Hezbollah and how they're essentially exploiting Lebanese sovereignty, which doesn't exist, to attack a neighbor and then bring the incoming back at the Lebanese people overall. There are real fundamental problems here in which you have to delineate where a sovereign government stands and what the policy is. And when you have rogue actors or, let's say, governments that are promoting agendas that are disruptive and not conducive to working out peaceful outcomes, that's where the problems need to be scrutinized.
But you said Israel is being held to a higher standard. I'm thinking. Sorry, Rabbi, but I'm thinking about the Sudanese civil war, Sudan in 2023. What continues to go on there, Darfur. Is Israel being held to a higher standard than some of these things that are going on in other parts of the world?
The Middle East is such a passionate place. News. It's a news hub. It's a place where there's this congregation of media, focus internationally, the Abrahamic religions, the Holy Land, the origins of so much of belief within the world. By nature of what it is, it's just going to draw that attention.
Well, to that, the symbolism.
Right. Add to that the other elements that I was talking about, the United Nations member states and the makeup of the United Nations, the personnel, the other elements of this, throwovers of the Cold War. Look at how things are starting to play out again. It's almost as if we've gone back to the Soviet-U.S. competition days in some quarters of what's happening. And that is because those alliances and divisions have maybe simmered down in some corners, but they're rearing their heads because of what's happening in the world and these pressures. Yeah. So historically, the Middle East has been a battleground of the Cold War. It sadly is taking on an image of that and certainly elements of it today. And, it can get worse. But what we have going on right now is pretty darn terrible.
I was telling the Reverend the other day that no one talks about Sudan, or very little attention is paid there. You see members of the black population decimated, and you don't see college students marching. You don't see articles being written. If they are, they're just minimal. The second point I want to make is you talk about the alliance between America and Israel, and you can't dictate to an ally what the ally should do in a number of circumstances. I remember the vice president, Harris, who said, don't go into Rafah. I've seen the maps. Do not go into Rafah. And Sinwar was taken out in Rafah. Right? And Israel made a decision. We have to go in and remove this evil. And America's saying, don't go in there. So you see a clear distinction between what's in your own best interest and what somebody else thinks is in your best interest.
That's right. Yeah. And arguably, there's a whole politically expedient aspect to what you're talking about. We can get into that, of course. But this is where you are going to see differences of opinion. And some of the opinions are pretty crappy. That's just what's going to happen. And, you're going to weigh these opinions, and then a nation needs to act in a way that is good for its people, but also good morally. And we are in an election, not only an election year, we're just a couple of weeks out on arguably the most important race that this country has faced. And politics, unfortunately, has been a major calculation in how policy was presented throughout this crisis. And that is really unfortunate, because when politics kicks in, then you're getting away from the core principles, the moral stand of a country, of what the United States, for instance, is supposed to stand for. And essentially, I don't know how else to call it, selling out for the expediency of trying to win over things in terms of what's politically expedient as opposed to what is morally the right thing.
Don't go into Rafah is a political calculation, not a moral calculation.
It is. I mean, let's not ignore that, and we can't. It's just not the right thing to do morally, that many, many people have lost their lives in Gaza. Those statistics are being fed in by the Hamas-run Ministry of Health, which is, of course, an operation of Hamas. And they do not delineate who's a combatant versus who's a civilian. We don't know that, and the numbers are really questionable, and there'll be more coming out about that in the coming months, and there'll be a reality check in which there's been a lot of hyperbole that's happened, but the numbers have been really tragic, and the basic truth, though, is those numbers have been very tragic because this conflict was allowed to continue much longer than it needed to. And there is the argument, had the IDF been able to operate in Rafah and not have its arms tied behind its back, this would have been resolved quicker, and there would have been less loss of life, as opposed to the argument that was made by some that there would be some horror show bloodbath as a result of going into Rafah. And, there's also the complication of what role did rogue actors connected to Egypt have to do with this, with these tunnels on the border? Rafah's right there. If you go there, it's, it's pretty ridiculous, the infrastructure that was there right on the border. And that, of course, has fueled this conflict and allowed things to be unchecked. The United Nations, through its relief agency, UNRWA, allowing all this stuff to be going on in terms of providing services to the Palestinian population, and allowing Hamas not to have to handle that, and allowing Hamas to instead work on how to destroy its neighbor and kill people. These are all factors in this.
Yeah, I don't. It's a somewhat rhetorical question, I guess, because let's put it this way. Rabbi just raised the conspiracy theorist in me, and I am aware from certain points in history where an administration would say, American government would say, don't do this, but it was just the face of the conversation. Behind the scenes, it was agreed upon between other entities that, this is exactly what's going to take place. But we want to make sure we distance ourselves from those actions. You've seen this, correct?
Oh, history is filled with that. As you were talking, I was thinking of what Stalin did with Hitler in terms of working out an agreement and then paying the price because the Nazis then invaded the Soviet Union, but trying to, divide up the world and working out something, thinking that Stalin thinking that he could collaborate with Hitler and work out some sort of path at the expense of nations in between these two countries, Germany and Russia, Moscow. So yes, history is filled with these types of compromises. Look at the Kurds, 60 million dispossessed people, 10 times larger, arguably close to, than the Palestinian situation, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That population completely messed up since you had their country divided up into portions going to Iran and Syria and Turkey. Just a mess and unfair, ultimately, to millions of people who suffer within the borders of these countries in many cases, certainly within the Islamic Republic of Iran, which disproportionately targets them for imprisonment and killing and crackdowns and ensuring that they don't have self-representation and a sense of self.
And you don't hear the UN.
The world is filled with these things.
Yeah, you don't hear the UN condemning the treatment or mistreatment of the Kurds. I don't hear resolutions one after the other as being done to Israel. I was Tom Friedman, and I'm not a fan of Tom Friedman, talks about some kind of international peacekeeping force going into Gaza. How does that work out, Jonathan, historically? We've seen UN peacekeeping forces that flee. We saw that in the north. We've seen it around the world. The minute you have an international peacekeeping force and people fire at them, they're gone.
Yeah, I mean, look, all we have to do is look at Lebanon and the way that UNIFIL, that force that was supposed to, I mean, arguably, they're part of the problem. Resolution 1701 after the war in 2006, Israel, turned off the guns and the fighting against Hezbollah because there was an agreement that Hezbollah would not be active in the area where it is, south of the Litani River in Lebanon. UNIFIL was created to oversee that, ensure that it never happened. And as a result, this problem just festered and got worse and worse and worse. And then you had the number of rockets and ballistic missiles piling up in South Lebanon targeting Israel. Mm-hmm. And we've seen history play out the way it has. And by the way, things could get very bad still between Hezbollah and Israel. I mean, Israel certainly is using the momentum it's had, but it still can be bad. And instead of speaking in one voice to try to contain this, certainly from UNIFIL's perspective, a couple of UN peacekeepers in Lebanon have been injured because their posts are right next to Hezbollah infrastructure. The IDF informed them to move. They didn't move, and they're in the middle of the problem, actually, probably, arguably, in some areas. If you would talk to IDF leadership, they would probably say they're standing in the way and actually interfering in the pace of what the Israelis are trying to do there. Now, that said, Israel going wanton violence inside Lebanon, killing civilians is not what anybody wants to see, and it can't happen, and there needs to be targeted, takeouts happening in Lebanon, and certainly the Lebanese people, proud Lebanese people are not thrilled in the long run. Some may be happy to see the IDF taking out Hezbollah, but they're not happy to see Israeli tanks and other arms and personnel in their country. So it gets very complicated, and these things have to play out, but have to play out in a way in which Israel certainly does have major responsibility to safeguard civilian populations and to try to defend itself in a way that really is reasonable and doesn't go outside the bounds of what is humanitarian law.
So,
but yeah, I was just going to shift, but in relationship to the Jewish population, especially here in the United States, we're about 2.5 weeks away from, a major election, to say the least. The direction of the nation, the tone of things. I'm prayerful concerning the period between election day and inauguration and what's going to happen, regardless of who wins. But how do we understand the fact that, according to Pew Research, 64% of the Jewish voters are or lean Democrat, and Jewish people, are people who tend to lean in the direction of conservatism, at least social conservatism. How do we understand such a large portion leaning in the direction of Democrats?
This is a very deep question, and I'm sure there are people who have analyzed, the very question you're asking. My sense of it is that the tradition of the Jewish people is that they're well-learned people. Not always. There are certainly many I've run into who are really not well-educated. But on a whole, education is a primary focus. Often what happens when people become educated, they learn to be critical thinkers and take into consideration other arguments that are out there and play the field and see what's out there and pick and choose what works. Now, an example of where that belief system has come, into a dire end is if you look at those communities that were attacked on October 7th. Many of those very people who were killed or are being held in hostage, suffering in the tunnels right now, if they're still alive, were progressive Jews who believed in coexistence, who were having the Palestinians coming out of Gaza working their properties and trying to have exchange programs and cross-border positive things going on. And the terrible thing is the actions of the types of Sinwar and that type of evil element that works against an effort at coexistence has blown that up and killed the very things that these progressive Jews in Israel, of all places, willing to accommodate the other side and listen to them and try to set up a coexistence where all that has unraveled. And here in the United States, for instance, you of course have a diaspora that is not living through what Israelis are going through now. And there's a disconnect. Unless you see it, unless you feel it, unless it directly affects you, it's hard to have the sympathies that would allow you to do it from the get-go. And generally, human nature is such that we all read about a tornado somewhere in some corner of the United States, and we're upset about it for a fleeting second. But if you're on the ground and living through that, that's a whole other picture. Yeah. And this is a similar type of thing. Now, the Jewish community, in terms of numbers, is so tiny that you can't help but have a connection, if you're a Jewish person, to what's going on over there, unless you're so opposed. And there are the very influential academicians like Noam Chomsky and that position on the conflict and the history of the Jewish people. They're a minority, but they do have influence, and that's a whole other thing to talk about. But I think what I'm trying to say is that you have a population, the majority of which tends to be quite educated and discerning in terms of open to and receptive to other ideas. And as a result of that, you end up with a less conservative position.
Yeah. I think also, if you look back, Jonathan, the vote for the Democrats within the Jewish community has been, I would say, Pavlovian over the years. Automatically, it would tend towards Democrat. I recall reading where members of the Jewish community were praising Roosevelt, great hero during that horrific period. And when you look deeper, he was not. He was not the great defender of the Jewish people, and yet there are those. Well, he's a Democrat. We have to go with him. I think the concept of tikkun olam, the repair of the world, has come back to really hurt us in the sense because it's been interpreted, help others and think less about yourself. And I see people who are so committed to what's going on around the world, but when it comes to Israel, and I'm talking about Jews, when it comes to Israel, there isn't that intensity, that emotional intensity, that care. So you see Jewish students marching against Israel, but not against what's happening in Sudan, not against what's happening to the Kurds. It's really shameful.
It is shameful. And, there's an interesting study being done at Princeton University that's looking at attitudes of Gen Z students. And just to give you a shortcut of what it says essentially conservatives living within the colleges and universities are used to critical thinking because they tend to be a minority on campus. And as a result of that, they're actually better rounded, according to the study that's being worked on, whereas progressives are in a groupthink mode. They're the TikTok generation, and they're taking a position, and they're not seeing things from another perspective. And I know we're not, this is a drift away from the discussion about, how American Jews feel about Israel and how that's been playing out. But that is another thing to take into consideration.
Yeah. So, where do you see us going? I know you've been working on trying to create a more civil spirit in discourse, but yet we're lacking that civility. I mean, we don't just disagree with the other. We look to destroy the other, to denigrate the other. Are we just naive in thinking we can bring more to the table in creating that new climate?
I think it's possible, and I'll get into what I do during the day when I'm not being a global affairs analyst. But I think it is possible for there to be a closing down of this horrible, unbridled polarization that we're living through. And I really think that it takes good leadership, and certainly when it comes to social media, you need moderation as well. And you need to shut down the troublemakers, give them a voice, but you can't let them dictate things.
Where faith matters. The Rev and the Rabbi. Talk Radio 77 WABC.
You need to shut that down, and you need to have the ability for people to listen to one another and actually figure out what is sensible and what is, as you said, Rabbi, just knee-jerk reaction of just speaking a certain position and not opening your ears to things. And we see that play out where politicians begin seeing that they're in peril. They begin to pander to what they see is happening with public perception on things. And if we can do that in such a way in which really the citizen is thinking about what the other side is saying, is introspecting, understanding, and leaders who are responsible rather than fanning the flames of discontent and polarization and feasting off of this dysfunction in society. If we can break that pattern, then we'll be a healthier nation. Then our decisions will be better. Then we can check politicians when they're pandering and taking moves that may not be sensible for the rest of the country or may not be moral, literally not moral, when making judgment calls that affect millions of people. And so what I'm doing through the social platform hour that my organization has created is giving municipal leaders, superintendents, nonprofit leaders, private sector leaders an opportunity to use a digital version of what their community is and engage, listen, give people a chance to speak, moderate it, and give feedback on what the majority sentiments are and why they came to that conclusion, but not for the sake of just espousing a majority position, but a majority position that has come about through deliberation and understanding the subject matter and coming out with something that seems rational for the community to move forward.
Let me ask you a question, Jonathan, because we've experienced, I will say that to a degree, we've become intoxicated by the power of illusion to manipulate perceptions and beliefs and realities and create essentially an alternate sense of truth. We see it by using media, social platforms, and even in the field of education. Do you think that we're going to recover from that, or are we going to be so glued to that power that we won't let it go?
As long as it's one thing that we all know. News media organizations, by nature of them, trying to fill the needs and wants of their readers or viewers or whatever, they will, of course, cater things in such a way. And that's going to happen. And as a person who digests the news, and I'm sure you gentlemen do it too, you take your sources from a variety of publications and channels because you want to see what's going on there. A rational person looks at that, who cares, a person who really is a person who really cares about their community and the world and are engaged. And we all know that that's not the majority of the population oftentimes, sadly. But there's a core there that does take that responsible role. And they are listening. And the more who are listening to a variety of ideas and perspectives and distilling it, and then espousing what makes sense, that's the better. And in some situations, there need to be leaders, or what my company Ourco has created through the Our app, in giving communities an opportunity to run this by their community, all their stakeholders, and discern what's going on before they make a judgment call, pre-test ideas with certain groups within their community, get to the right place, then make the decision. But don't rush to conclusions. Allow the process to work of people trying to figure out what makes sense. A good leader listens to his or her constituents and really listens and has the moral fabric to stand up when something's wrong, to stand and have the courage. You know, obviously in a political season and Congress members who have to switch and defend their positions every 2 years, that's a hard thing to defend, and politics gets in and pandering for certain groups. But if you're in there and you're able to do the good fight and do the right thing and listen, I think we can fight back at this dysfunction of our country.
So that shows that faith leaders, I think, have a major responsibility to confront that challenge. I mean, you know, people think in sound bites. They hear sound bites, they think in sound bites. And to go through this critical examination of an issue and then reach a conclusion rather than come to the conclusion, then perhaps look at, you know, some of the facts, that's what we're up against. So I think we do have to fight that, because if we want civility, we have to show civility in how we treat one another. And I think faith communities have done a fairly good job. I mean, we have relations with one another where we speak regularly. We talk about issues, you know, we can disagree, but we don't destroy the other. And that has to be emblematic of what we're trying to do in the nation.
Now, Rabbi, I have to ask you, because when it comes, I'm sorry for Jonathan cutting you off, because now our pulpit comes into play, and the power of that pulpit, it we believe is a God-given platform to speak into the hearts and minds of the people who come to hear us, but they don't come to hear another lesson in politics, and yet we have to express in some way how our faith tradition applies to what's happening socially and politically, and that can be a challenge, Rabbi.
You know, it is difficult, and I speak to some of the younger members of the clergy who they're nervous because they're in a pulpit and they want to, you know, express a certain point of view, not necessarily endorsing candidates, but talking about an issue. And they're afraid, how is this going to play when people are so polarized? It's difficult for them. We went through that. But I think at the end of the day, you have to be able to look in the mirror and say, this is who I am, and what I'm doing is in the best interest of my community, because we're not going to get very far if we just, you know, have these sound bites that don't address the issue properly. But it's hard. And certainly, look, we've been in the pulpit for a while, Rev, and we say what we want to say, and we know that if people disagree, they have the right to disagree, but they're not going to deter us from saying what we think should be said. And we don't endorse candidates, right? We talk about issues. What does our tradition say about the issue? And then apply it and give people some latitude there. But it is a challenge, and we as older clergy, well, you as older clergy, have a responsibility. You know, we have a responsibility to be mentors for younger people and to also show the community that we have to do this. You know, the prophetic voice has to be heard, and not be intimidated by those who want to diminish our role.
And tolerance
go ahead.
is at the core of that, you know, within one's own congregation. And you two, you know, men of the cloth are able to talk to your congregants, and I'm sure you get an earful sometimes with members of the congregation.
No, never.
Love what but you're going to get it. You're going to get it. But you're going to address. You're going to address, unless they're a lunatic, but you're going to address what they're saying. If there's rational thought to what they're saying, you're going to accommodate it in your next sermon. or whatever you're going to do, but you're going to do that. You're exactly the examples of what we need, and doing away with this level of intolerance and tribalism. That's the problem. This inability to open one's ears and eyes that there are whole other ways of thinking, and there are different ways to get to God, but there are ways to get to God that are good for humanity overall, that enrich our pluralistic society. And then there are ways to get to God that are just so narrow-minded and often misogynistic and all the other trimmings that are just awful and need to be avoided and cause bloodshed and rift. And that's where you had, the movement of Karl Marx and, religion, the opioid of the people and things like that. There was an argument for that. That's why that became so popular, because people got turned off by all the discontent caused sometimes and fomented by religion. But if you bring that tolerance in together with that deeper understanding amongst your congregants, we're in heaven.
Yeah. Well,
I think important for us to understand that unity is in diversity, not uniformity.
Yeah.
And until we grasp that and embrace it, we're going to continue to be divided. And I'm going to try to, impose my way on you as the only way.
Yeah. Jonathan Wachtel, always a pleasure to have you with us. Listening to you, I think people see someone who thinks through an issue deeply and then arrives at an opinion place, rather than someone who just goes there immediately without the thought process, the deliberation. So we're very privileged to have you. We look forward to having you again. That's Jonathan Wachtel, who's a global affairs analyst and the former director of communications for former ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Jonathan. And thank you, our listeners. We'll be right back with more of the Rev and the Rabbi right here on 77 WABC.
Reverend A.R. Bernard, Rabbi Joseph Potasnik, the Rev and the Rabbi. Talk Radio 77 WABC and the all-new WABCRadio.com.
Welcome back. I'm Rabbi Joseph Potasnik.
And I'm Reverend A.R. Bernard.
Reverend, that was a very, very thoughtful, civil, deliberative conversation where we were able to really appreciate listening to an analysis without yelling, without shouting, and recognizing that this is the path on which we need to travel.
Yeah. I enjoy every time we have Jonathan on the program because of his perspective and his knowledge of history, both political and social history, and bringing it to the issues of the day. I think it's fantastic to have this kind of conversation. I'm sure our listeners do as well. And you learn some things.
Yeah. And when I listen to all of this, I think to myself, there is a clear double standard. Israel, the removal of Sinwar is a very positive thing. I assure you, there will not be a resolution at the UN commending Israel for taking out this evil. They just won't.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, you might get a resolution condemning Israel. But the world really should say, thank you, Israel. Look at what you've done. And you've taken out others who look to destroy. They're not looking to grow the Palestinian people, to find a way to live with Israel. They want to find a way for people to live without Israel.
There's a wonderful passage in the book of Proverbs in the Jewish Bible, I believe, the Hebrew Bible.
The original.
And the original. And it simply says, where there's no wood, the fire goes out.
Mm-hmm.
How true is that? That when we remove what's fueling the divisions, the polarization, the disunity, etc., that's when things will change. And sometimes it requires a surgical strike or a surgical removal.
Yeah. And it also requires people to look within. Look, the people of Lebanon, Lebanon is the country of Hezbollah. Hezbollah has taken over Lebanon. So Israel is not looking to control Lebanon. They're looking to remove Hezbollah because that's the source of evil. And I have to believe that the people of Lebanon very much want the elimination of Hezbollah, the containment of Hezbollah, so they can regain authority and govern themselves in the country. So this is a critical moment, and that's why to say to Israel, "Don't go into Rafah," when militarily you have to go into Rafah. I mean, again, what's politically expedient is something that is injurious to the interest of the other country. So, it plays well politically. Oh, we're telling Israel, don't go into Rafah. But the truth is they have to. So there's a disconnect between what's right and what's political.
Yeah, and it's been like that for quite a while. We just see it more blatantly in front of us. And that's why I question, what are we putting on the face for the public and what's really being agreed upon behind the scenes. And, quite often they're two different things.
Yeah.
That's the reality.
And I tell you, this phrase, the right to defend itself, I think people need to question that. What does that really mean? If you're attacked, you have the right to defend yourself. That's a no-brainer. Everybody has a right to defend himself or herself. But the right to attack another because you want to prevent a future attack, that somehow is lost in the equation.
Yeah. Well, we don't have our Catholic brethren with us to discuss just war theory. We'll have to get behind that. Rabbi, a pleasure speaking with you on all these issues, and of course, a great guest and another incredible program right here on 77 WABC with the Rev
and the Rabbi.
Since 1981, Unbound has connected people like you with families worldwide on their self-directed paths out of poverty. A brighter future is possible for these families when we all walk together. Sponsor a child today, and you'll help a family take the first steps on their path. Change their future in just one click. Start walking with your new friend today at unbound.org/walk.